Good afternoon. This is March 2024 Director's Cut. We have here Dr. Lynn Helms, who will be giving us the latest production numbers for March.
Thank you, Bridget, and thanks to those of you who stopped in and those that tuned in. Our March report will be looking at December and January production. Quite an interesting story. Winter really can bite here in North Dakota, and as you know, we had very severe cold weather in the month of January. So we actually saw production decline by 13.5% on the oil side and by about 15% on the gas side. So that gas oil ratio stayed lower. It actually would have ticked down just slightly. All of that due to the winter weather that we had. It looks like as of today, we've probably fully recovered and maybe are actually above that December production, which was a really good number at 1.27 million barrels a day. So we ought to be pressing that 1.3 million barrel a day number. One other number I want to throw out there, we're getting very, very close to 5 billion barrels from the Bakken, but something that I saw that was very significant in the stats as I was working them up, and I wanted to make sure and mention it today, was that the MHA nation crossed that billion barrel mark. And so from Fort Berthold Reservation, we've now produced over 1 billion barrels of crude oil. That's really remarkable, considering that when I started this job in 1998, there had not been a well drilled on Fort Berthold in 10 years at that time. And so from about 1988, actually it was late 1990s or 87 when that well was spud, until 2006 when the partial discovery well was drilled. No drilling on Fort Berthold Reservation, and now since 2006 those lands on Fort Berthold have produced just over 1 billion barrels of crude oil. That's really remarkable. It speaks to the difference in technology from what it was back in the 1980s and 1990s. Just a little trivia for all you folks. On the oil price side, we're finally today ticking back above the revenue forecast numbers. So December and January both slightly below revenue forecast numbers, but production was above. So all in all, state revenues in very good condition, pretty much right on track, if not a little bit above what was predicted going into this biennium. On the natural gas side, we did see gas capture drop a couple percent. So we fell to 93% capture, still above our 91% goal, but largely when we get those really sudden winter storms, it's gas capture that controls everything. In the previous life, pre-2014, the wells would have gone to flare and just kept producing oil. But in today's world, the very first thing to happen is that the gas gathering systems fill up with liquids when it gets really cold like that. And then the restriction in gas gathering and gas processing ripples back, and wells get shut in or curtailed in order to maintain above the 91% gas capture number. And in fact, most of our operators have a 0% routine flaring rule. And not surprisingly, our three biggest operators say that last year they were at 1 to 2% routine flaring, and their goal is 0. So we saw our gas capture volume fall, our gas capture percentage fall just slightly, and that left us with our record numbers from December. Drilling rig count stays steady at less than 40. Just talking, I'll throw this in, conversations with our oil and gas operators back in February when we made the trip down to Houston. The plans are overall for only 1 to 2 more rigs in 2024 than we had in 2023. So we think we're going to hit that 40 rig number as the spring continues on and the weather moderates. But we were still at 38 today, and 38 in February, and 38 in January. So very, very steady as far as that goes. Our sister state, New Mexico, 106 rigs running down there. That's the difference between a state that has winter and one that doesn't. And I know they say they have winter, but they have no idea what it really is. So we'll just go with that. On the permitting front, solid numbers coming in at 78 in January, 63 in February. On the completion numbers, still 92 wells completed in February, 13 frac crews running today. So just about optimized for 38 to 40 rigs. That's just pretty much optimum. And that really shows in the duck well count. You see, we're below 300 for the first time in as long as I can remember, at 284 wells. So we just really have essentially no duck well inventory left at all. We did not set a new high in terms of active producing wells. Again, that was the blizzard and the cold weather and the shut-in wells. Interestingly enough, we didn't see a big uptick in inactive wells, so that's encouraging. Usually that comes because of snow. A lot of our marginal wells in the far northern tier, Burke, Renville, Bottineau County, when we get heavy snow, it doesn't pay to plow the roads, and those wells get shut in until spring. But we haven't seen that this year. So unless we get the Class B blizzard, which is a North Dakota tradition, then we might see that happen. Fort Berthold activity has picked up 7 rigs, but the production was way down. 30,000 barrels a day of the drop that we saw occurred on Fort Berthold, and so very dramatic results there. One thing I want you to note: we've calibrated our future potential wells on Fort Berthold to take into account that the remaining spacing units are more than likely going to be 3-mile and 4-mile wells. So we've recalibrated that to take those extra well bores off of that inventory and get that down to a more realistic number. So it's still in the neighborhood of a couple thousand wells with 2,661 wells producing. Interestingly enough, they have not added a producing well in over 5 months. So there's drilling going on, but really nothing in the completion world on Fort Berthold for the last 5 months. And a lot of that has to do with right-of-way problems and getting gas gathering and processing pipelines in place. For example, one operator that I talked to in Houston had 4 wells that had been fracked and are sitting there shut in, and 4 more wells drilled on that same pad that they haven't fracked yet. So 8 duck wells, 8 of our 284 duck wells are on that one pad on Fort Berthold, waiting on a BIA right-of-way. So again, we're back to the right-of-way problems. My understanding is there's just one person, one individual working right-of-ways in the BIA office in Newtown, and that it's just not progressing at the pace that the industry would like to see. It looks like U.S. Private crude inventories and world private crude inventories are about normal, but the SPR is still extremely low, 1980s levels in terms of storage there. On the gas capture side, no really big changes there. Everything fell 1 to 2% on the gas capture side. I think the thing to kind of follow up on is that natural gas storage is now 37% above the 5-year average, and that's reflected in today's price. Today's price at Watford City, $1.13 for 1,000 cubic feet of natural gas. Those are prices we haven't seen since the 1990s, and so we're seeing rigs lay down in the natural gas plays, the Marcellus and the Haynesville, like there's no tomorrow. These gas prices are like a third of what they anticipated based on planned liquefied natural gas exports to Europe that are now on hold from the Department of Energy. So we're still highlighting our 5 areas where gas capture is struggling and where there are efforts underway to get more gathering and more compression and more processing in place. And so you can see those highlighted there in our gas capture section. On the federal rule front, we have one deadline looming. EPA has now released its rule on waste emissions charges for petroleum and natural gas systems. This was something that was put into statute in the Inflation Reduction Act. And so it's statutorily required by Congress. But we've got some super heartburn with how the EPA has laid out this rule. A number of factors, but one of them is the way gas emissions are going to be aggregated. And if they're aggregated the way they're proposed in the rule, we're going to see thousands of North Dakota marginal wells put on the block in terms of becoming uneconomic because they'll have to pay this fee. The fee is mandatory in the statute. That's not going to change, but it's the way the production is aggregated. And so it turns operators, it's being aggregated under the current rule by operator, by basin. So if as an operator, your emissions exceed the 25,000 ton limit, every bit of emissions that you have above that's going to have to pay the fee. And we've got a lot of operators that operate marginal wells that emit almost nothing in Burke, Renville, and Bottineau County. But when you aggregate them that way, it's really problematic. The other thing that's interesting is they're planning to aggregate by basin. The philosophy behind that, I can see the rationale, and that is that gas emissions don't care if there's a state line or a county line or something like that in a sedimentary basin. But the Williston Basin extends into Canada, where the EPA has zero jurisdiction. It extends into Manitoba and Saskatchewan. So if you're going to aggregate by basin, you've got a serious problem with the Williston Basin, a serious jurisdictional problem. So we'll be making comments on that rule. Comments are due by March 26th. And so we'll be commenting extensively there. I may have touched on this and forgotten, but just some discussions with our oil and gas operators from last month down in Houston, planning for 10 to 15,000 barrel a day production increase, 1 to 2 drilling rigs, bringing in an e-frac fleet. So we'll see our first electronic frac fleet along with electronic drilling. And before I talk about one of the questions that we got or answer questions, we're very close to TD on our second what do I call it? A YouTube well. So Slauson Oil and Gas has drilled now 2 wells that drill a mile in one direction, make a 180-degree turn, and drill a mile back parallel to that first half of the lateral. The first one already has the liner in it and cemented. The second one hasn't had any drilling problems. And so this is brand new technology that's going to turn 640-acre spacing units into 1280 spacing units now, essentially. And so it's really remarkable their plans on drilling and completing these wells. And so it's really the equivalent of drilling a 4-mile lateral. And we're anxious to see when these wells get completed what the performance looks like. But the idea that you can spud a well and drill a mile in one direction, turn the well 180 degrees and drill back 1,000 feet over in the opposite direction is really quite amazing to me. Nobody would have dreamed of that 20 years ago. And so the technology keeps marching on. I'll put in a shameless plug for the Wilson Basin Conference, March 14, 15, 16, right here in Bismarck. I hope everybody attends. We did get one question online. It's very, very detailed. It has a lot of questions. It's a multi-part question, and it's about the lease sales, which I'm just digesting the transcript from the February 9th status conference we had here. I'm not going to attempt to answer this online. We'll get an answer back offline in writing, Bridget, or we'll call this individual and chat with them and answer their questions.
So we have 3 questions. The first one is, with the back-end growth program coming to an end, how do you feel about the back-end workforce going forward?
Okay, so interestingly enough, a year ago, all we heard was workforce. And we had originally planned to have a whole section of the Wilson Basin Conference be about workforce. We still have part of one session on that because North Dakota has instituted the Career and Technical Education Academies in order to address that future workforce issue. But we no longer hear that from industry. So it seems to be a problem that has worked itself out. In fact, I've eliminated that as one of the major drivers of our slow growth progress. So it would appear that, at least for the short term, our workforce issues are pretty much resolved.
And then the second question, what is the average barrels per month production of a new oil well roughly?
So for a new North Dakota well, it's roughly 1,600 barrels of oil a day for a new well coming on. They actually bring our new wells on in a restricted state these days. They generally will run an electric submersible pump in the well pretty much day one, and then they'll throttle the well back and try to sustain that 1,600 barrels a day for 6, 8, 9 months. So they're producing these wells in a very different manner than they did, 10 years ago. So on average, about 1,600 barrels a day. And the 3-mile wells in the Tier 2 geology are matching what the 2-mile and hopefully the YouTube wells are going to do in the core area.
The third question, how much does oil production decrease per month, or how would you describe the rate at which production decreases over time?
So I'm going to answer that in parts. On a statewide basis, we expect oil production to increase about 2% a year, plateauing at about 1.4 million barrels a day. On an individual well these days, it used to be that a well would decline about 65% in the first year. It probably declines at less than half that rate now with the restricted production and turning on the artificial lift and the variable speed submersible pumps or gas lift that they install. They're able to match the production to the gas capture capacity and sustain a much lower decline for a much longer period of time. So year over year, a new well used to decline 65%. It's less than 30% probably these days.
I have some more new questions coming in about 3.
Okay, we better give Joey and Dave a chance.
Yeah.
My first question is about those e-fracs. I guess the grid up there is pretty strained. Will they sort of come on in sort of a constrained way, or is there going to be any way to sort of make sure they don't eat up too much electricity?
Yeah, the question was, with the e-frac coming to North Dakota, we know that the grid is under a lot of stress, and we've seen a lot about that in the news media just recently about the impact of the data centers and all of that's going on. So the answer to that is that they've also got I guess you'd say a child company. I think they're one of the innovations that Halliburton funded called VoltaGrid. And so they have the capacity to come into an e-frac area. And much like we have lay flat pipes for moving frac water, lay out a grid of electric cables and use natural gas to generate the 30 to 36 megawatts that are required for the e-frac fleet. The other thing that they're looking at is locating that e-frac fleet kind of at a central location and laying high pressure lines out to as many as 5 or 6 well pads from the frac fleet, so it doesn't have to move, and just the surface pipelines would move. Now, obviously, a pipeline with 10,000 or 11,000 psi on it has some serious safety risks, and so that's less desirable. But they'll use it where they can, where you're not going through populated areas or something like that. But the real answer is the VoltaGrid, which will allow them to locate a natural gas to electricity generation facility and run the power line to wherever the e-frac fleet decides to land.
Could enough of those theoretically help with like the remaining amount of flaring, or probably not enough?
Oh, absolutely. They consume a huge amount of natural gas, and so if they can coordinate that properly, it'll help with some of those flaring issues. Like in the 5 areas that I've identified in particular, like when you look at that area up north of Williston in the Alamo area, there's serious restrictions on the gathering capacity up there, and so a VoltaGrid could really solve some problems up there.
And my other question is about the low gas price. How can we definitely attribute that to the LNG export decision? Are there other factors potentially too, or is that a big one?
How do we attribute the low gas price to the LNG decision? I'll say this. Number one, all of the natural gas drillers attributed to that. And number two, it happened within 3 days of that decision being announced. So, and we just haven't seen any recovery. In fact, we've seen natural gas prices continue to decline slightly from the massive drop that they took in that first week after that decision was announced. So I think the evidence is pretty strong. Usually it's 3 strikes, you're out. We've got 2 out of 3. So
That's all I have a question.
For somebody who hasn't really looked at it that much, how does e-frac work?
yeah, so the question was, how does e-frac work? E-frac means that the frac pumps that pump the high pressure water and frac sand are no longer driven by diesel semi-trailer mounted diesel engines and operated by human beings. They're skid mounted. They have a variable speed electric motor on them, and it's connected to an artificial intelligence engine called, I got to look up the word here, Octave AI. Another innovation that Halliburton funded, that they've now brought into their fold, Octave AI, which actually controls the pumps, the rates and pressures on a millisecond basis. So I saw some comparative frac charts from side by side zipper fracs or triple fracs that were occurring in the Permian, where they had used Octave AI and an e-frac versus a conventional frac fleet, and the ability to sustain precisely the rate and pressure that you want to fracture the rock was remarkable. Not to mention that they were able to optimize and avoid damage on the pumps, and they're able to keep their pumps running 20 to 23 hours out of 24. So the repairs go way down. So it's highly automated. It's being controlled from a central facility, and it actually is responding to signals from a fiber optic cable that is deployed through the lateral to the end when the whole frac process starts. So it's like 2 orders of magnitude change in the technology. So that's e-frac, Octave, and VoltaGrid, kind of all bundled into one. I'm anxious to see one of those out in the field. It should be happening out in the Tioga area on a Hess location sometime in June.
Any comments on how DAPO trial is going?
So I hear little bits and pieces. It appears to be going extremely well. We're dealing with a federal judge that's pretty familiar, lived here during the DAPO experience. And so from what I'm hearing, the tort case is going extremely well. The DAPO EIS, on the other hand, has pretty much been just put on the shelf. And we're planning for our cooperating agencies to make a trip to Omaha to visit with the Corps of Engineers folks about that. But the signal that we're getting back on that is that decision is not going to happen until either right before or right after the election, depending on how they think it might play.
2 more questions. Was cold weather the only reason for the drop in oil January production?
Yes, the recovery, of course, is all dependent on workforce and that sort of thing, but that's going pretty well. Yeah, when we had, I think it was 4 consecutive days, maybe 5, when the wind chills were below -70. So the cold weather hit and the equipment responded not well, as you might imagine. And then the ability to for human beings to go out and work on that equipment and keep wells producing or keep things operating was strongly inhibited by the -70 wind chill. So yeah, we pin it all on the cold weather factor.
Last question. You mentioned Houston operators active in the back end are planning for a 10 to 15,000 BPD production increase. And this through 2024, and this is due to adding 1 to 2 more rigs.
Yeah, the plan is to add 1 to 2 more rigs and probably 1 frac fleet. Of course, if E-frac works out as hoped, we'll see some big efficiency increases from that. And so it may be possible that we don't need as many frac fleets under that scenario, but we'll see how that plays out. Yep.
More questions are coming in.
Okay.
You said that you expect oil production to grow at 2% per year
Mhm.
and plateau around 1.4 billion per day.
1.4 million per day.
That's the question.
Correct.
And then the last question now, is there any upside to the forecast from the E-frac technology, and how many E-frac crews are at work right now in North Dakota?
Yeah, so as I stated, we think that E-frac is going to improve the efficiency and the productivity of our stimulation work. Maybe 10 to 20%, just because of being able to sustain hour by hour the optimum rate and pressure for the frac job and the proppant loading, and then being able to keep the pumps operating 23 out of 24 hours a day. So a lot of potential for efficiencies and better frac jobs. None operating here today. The first one is anticipated to be deployed in June in North Dakota. There are, I'm not sure of the count. I think there are 3 or 4 operating in the Permian at this point. And so they decided to test it out at Texas temperatures.
That was the last question.
Okay.
Thank you.
Anything else, guys? Thank you.
We have here Director Pipeline, Justin Kringstad, who will be giving us the report for March 2024.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Justin Kringstad, Director of the North Dakota Pipeline Authority. We'll get right in. Our first couple slides, taking a look at our neighboring states. On slide 2, that was just the number from Lynn, and then on slide 3, still waiting on some of the data to come in from eastern Montana as well as South Dakota. If you can, yeah. Now we'll go to this one. You can see that month over month change. The only thing I'll add to that, if anyone is interested, Lynn did a good job describing some of the challenges on the natural gas capture side and what that looked like. One of the more recent slide decks on my website, I've got a timeline of events, kind of how things unfolded on the natural gas side. It's starting with some notices and things going out by our large interstate gas transmission companies, warning shippers to get ahead of the impending weather. We knew for a while that this cold snap was going to come. It was a nationwide event, and so the whole gas market was moving rapidly to position itself to address it. As that cold weather moved in, you saw the producers at the wellhead struggling with not only equipment, the pigging, the natural gas liquids dropping out, and just the manpower and the personnel it takes to keep those facilities safely operating. All of that taking place and gas scheduling, then trickling, working its way back and forth between the interstate gas transmission companies that need to keep full so that they can make deliveries to communities and businesses around the U.S. You've got operators trying to do their scheduling, and so it was a very choreographed effort for a good chunk of time there as folks were trying to, again, stay on top of it, deliver what they could, and if they were not able to deliver, those other gas participants needing to find that gas elsewhere during that time frame. And so we saw a big influx of Canadian gas coming down, backfilling that lost Bakken gas in order to keep things full. Again, I'm not aware of any delivery constraints or anything of that nature. Everything was on the upstream on the supply side. So again, that full timeline is on my website. If you're curious and if you have questions, certainly reach out to me. When we start to take a look at the crude oil side now, the only real big month over month change is we saw less crude oil being trucked and railed over the border up into Canada. Everything else was fairly status quo. Everything a little bit depressed with the overall reduction in production volumes. You can see those trends continuing just that uptick in pipeline market share, starting to see just that slight less and less market share on the rail side with prices where they're at. Nothing surprising there. Pad 1, Pad 5 are continue to be the only 2 locations that do take North Dakota deliveries with the most recent information we have. Again, for those refineries over in that extreme east coast of the U.S. and the extreme northwest corner, we do not have any pipeline ability to move our crude oil to those facilities. So it is completely reliant on rail movements for those refiners in the U.S. to receive that domestic supply from North Dakota. When we look at overall volumes, because of that dip in overall production, we're around 110,000 barrels per day. So slightly less in my estimates than a couple trains a day in the month of January. And then slide 9 for those that are keeping track, bulk of that going to the Pacific Northwest and those refiners. When we look at pricing, this has been moving fairly rapidly, almost by the day and certainly by the week. When we look at what's taking place, you can see the national benchmarks, the Cushing, the Brent at the global side. The one thing that we have seen some improvement in the last couple of weeks has been on the Clearbrook pricing. Much of 2022, much of 2023 saw very strong pricing at Clearbrook. Last fall, if you recall, there was some market concerns with the timing of the Trans Mountain, the TMX system up in Canada, when that would go into service. Right at the end of February, first part of March, some news was starting to come out that they were looking to do line fill on that system starting in April. And that was kind of the first hint, I think, that the market had seen of when that system would go into play. And we started to see Canadian prices strengthen as a result of that information. Bakken, Clearbrook pricing strengthen at the same time. So last month when we were here, it was over $2 discount at Clearbrook. That's shrunk now to less than $1. We'll see if we can get that back up into the premium territory, but this is where the market is as of today. Slide 11, this was what I alluded to earlier. We did see a sharp decrease in those movements north into Canada out of North Dakota. And then switching gears, slide 12, this is just the breakdown of that gas flaring. all of that growth that we saw in January flaring can be attributed to wells that were connected. And so again, that is just strictly down to operational constraints and operational challenges on those systems and for those operators. And then slide 13, just for history, where that 7% fits into that overall trend continues to be a really positive story. And so I do not anticipate that this blip in January will be continued. I think we'll get back down into that 5% range relatively quickly when those February numbers start to come out. Slide 14, again, strong numbers in gas gathering. I know despite the cold weather, there, you heard from Lynn earlier, a lot of activity on the well completions and the activity on the producer side. Same thing on the midstream side. So very encouraged, nothing to be concerned about there. The EIA did increase their oil price outlook here through now the end of 2025. So they're anticipating we get back up into the 80s. I think we're there as of today, but staying there throughout much of 2024 before that gradual decrease. But they did increase their outlook several dollars. And when you think about the Bakken, all of that matters when we look at our competitiveness and how we see the activity in the region continuing. Natural gas, because of that increase in crude oil, my forecast models are all driven by oil price and then trickling that back to activity. So this forecast is slightly higher than what you saw last month. And that has to do with where the EIA was putting their oil price outlooks and then translating that back into production. On the interstate transmission side, if we fast forward, we talked about the 20 January events. As of today, where we're at March forward, approaching 90% market share on that system. And so this is our last capacity available largely until we see the Bison Express project come online. There are some efficiencies and some ways to eke out a bit more movement in some other directions, but by and large, this is the one we want to continue to watch closely. And then on the BTU side, as we take up market share, naturally, that Bakken gas is very high in BTU content, and we're seeing that BTU level as that stream exits North Dakota continue to stay relatively strong. So with that, I'd be glad to answer any questions anyone has.
I do just remind, where Bison Express, that take gas to Cheyenne?
Correct. So the question was about the Bison Express, Bakken Express. It's got a couple different names depending upon who's operating that component of it, but that is the TC reversal of that 30-inch Bison pipeline from Glen, North Dakota down, and then two interconnecting systems that eventually get you to Cheyenne. Yep.
What's the in-service date?
Targeting the first quarter of 2026.
Any idea what that might mean for price or production at this point?
It's gonna, so the question for those online, what does that mean for North Dakota? It's gonna be absolutely critical for North Dakota's continued production levels. With that increasing GOR over time, we need to have these gas transmission systems, the gas gathering, processing, all of that needs to be there in order to support not only the gas production, which is what you think about first, but in tune, it's gonna be necessary to keep our crude oil where it needs to be.
Is there another project?
That is the only, so late last year in November of 2023, WBI had their Grasslands project, a similar one to Cheyenne that went into service. Yep. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Was that